Michael III sat on the throne for 25 years, yet for hardly any of the time that he reigned could it be said that he actually ruled. For it is one thing to reign, and another entirely to rule. He was only 2 when his father died, but even as he matured, he never grasped the full extent of his responsibilities. In truth, Michael was simply too weak-willed, too childishly disdainful of the boring work of governance to properly assert himself. Instead, his tenure was dominated by a succession of powerful ministers. It was they who provided much of the impetus to Michael's reign, and it was they who made many of its great advances. With this in mind, we cannot really start with Michael himself. Rather, we must first turn to his mother, Theodora. Born in Paphlagonia, a mountainous land famed for its eunuchs and swineherds, sometime around 815, there was little in young Theodora's life that set her apart. Certainly, not in her wildest dreams did she think that she would one day reign as empress, though this was not to say she had nothing going for her. Theodora was blessed with a famous beauty, and she was bright, as her future career would make clear. Furthermore, while her father was mostly undistinguished, one of her uncles had held high office under Leo V, briefly having been charged with command of every Asian theme. It does seem that her family had at least some connection to the courts of Leo V and Michael II. Even so, there was no reason to expect that it would be Theodora in particular who would be so suddenly plucked from obscurity. Somewhat ironically, given her firm belief in images, Theodora's birth coincided with the reintroduction of iconoclasm as official imperial policy. Despite this, her family held iconophile sympathies, though they didn't advertise them, and Theodora was immersed in iconophilia from a young age. However, if her family was opposed to iconoclasm at heart, it wasn't a hill they were ready to die on. In time, both Theodora and one of her sisters would marry iconoclasts. This pragmatism was not unique to her family though. In truth, the second period of iconoclasm never saw the same fervour or strength of feeling that defined the first. When Leo V reintroduced iconoclasm, he did so to link himself to the glory days of the first iconoclast period, not due to any sense of religious devotion. Michael II was more of the same, having few convictions either way. Accordingly, iconoclasm was never enforced very strictly. Many in the empire, like branches blowing in the political wind, were content to officially follow imperial doctrine, even if they had little passion for it. Though Theophilus would prove to be more fervent, by his day iconoclasm was clearly running out of steam. In 829, when Michael II died and his 17-year-old son Theophilus succeeded him, Theodora's life would be changed forever. The new emperor, though young, needed heirs nonetheless. It was a priority that he marry, so his stepmother Euphrosyne duly set about finding him a suitable wife. To this end, she organised a so-called bride show, which was exactly what it sounds like. Beautiful young women were summoned from across the empire and paraded before Theophilus, who then got to choose one. It was here that Theodora's natural beauty gave her a leg up, for it was she, of the many hundreds who no doubt turned up, whom Theophilus eventually picked. She was crowned empress on the 5th of June, 830. For the rest of her husband's reign, she was mostly preoccupied with a ceaseless string of pregnancies. Between 830 and 840, she bore 7 children. Tragically, their first son died young in 835, but they persevered, and in 840 they were blessed once more with an heir. They named him Michael. His birth came not a moment too soon, because just 2 years later Theophilus was dead. Suddenly, Michael III was thrust onto the throne aged 2, the youngest occupant ever to hold the office. Naturally, he would need a regent, and so Theodora finally came into her own. Unsurprisingly, Theodora's first goal as regent was to root out iconoclasm once and for all. Already it had begun to fade somewhat. If you recall, during the first iconoclasm, which lasted from 726 to 787, the doctrine's greatest claim to fame had been its military credentials. The first iconoclast emperors, Leo III and Constantine V, had been superb generals, and because of them iconoclasm had gained a reputation as the doctrine of military victory. Since 815, however, the second iconoclasm had not seen such success. Crete and Sicily fell prey to Muslim invaders, while in 838 Arab armies were able to penetrate the eastern frontier, sacking and destroying the mighty city of Amorium. These military disasters dented iconoclasm's reputation, and now iconophiles were able to argue it the other way. Far from helping Byzantium, iconoclasm was clearly bringing God's wrath down upon them. The tide began to turn, and Theodora would not face any noticeable opposition from the army. Nevertheless, purging the empire of iconoclasm would be no easy task, for many in the church still held to the doctrine. Theodora would have to move with care. She knew this well. Luckily for her, she was no fool, and she could count on the support of a group of very talented individuals, including the eunuch Theoktistos, as well as her brothers Bardas and Patronus. Like herself, her brothers were secret iconophiles, while Theoktistos had been an iconoclast who now switched sides. The first roadblock they faced was the Patriarch of Constantinople, a staunch iconoclast and an old friend of Theophilus called John the Grammarian. He would not go quietly, so Theodora reckoned that if he would not jump, then he would just have to be pushed. Already the Empress had penciled in his replacement, an iconophile of renown known as Methodius, but it would take 13 months before Theodora succeeded in sliding him into place. In the meantime, she had a commission of other monks sift through Christian teachings to gather up as much evidence in favour of icons as possible. Then, in March 843, 14 months after Theophilus' death, a council was summoned to finally settle the whole issue. Once again, Patriarch John was the only problem in an otherwise trouble-free council, with him stubbornly refusing to go. In the end, Theodora had him deposed, and old Methodius was installed in his place, and sacred icons were finally restored. This day, the 11th of March 843, was famed as the so-called Triumph of Orthodoxy, with it being celebrated every year hereafter by the Orthodox churches. Iconoclasm had been banished for the last time, never to return. The emperors of former iconoclast days were cursed as heretics, which did leave Theodora in a tricky situation. For Theophilus, her husband and the father of the current emperor, now risked being doomed to hellfire. This had serious implications for the legitimacy of the dynasty, so Theodora began circulating the story that Theophilus had had a last-minute conversion on his deathbed and kissed an icon of Christ before he died. Obviously this story was untrue, but it was a useful fiction, and so nobody really questioned it, allowing Theodora to get out of a bind and ensure her son's legitimacy. Now she had to make sure her victory lasted. The government was therefore very lenient in its dealings with iconoclast churchmen, with many being allowed to go back to their posts in return for a simple denunciation of iconoclasm. Similarly, even after the return of images, many of Constantinople's greatest icons were not returned to their rightful places for many years, in order to decrease the likelihood of any serious iconoclast pushback. In fact, Theodora's administration was so generous with the defeated iconoclasts that in the early days the greatest threat to stability actually came from the extreme iconophiles who believed that Theodora was being too lenient. Eventually, though, the issue was put to bed. The Empress could now properly set about ruling the empire. In her efforts, she would come to rely upon the eunuch Theoktistos, who was quickly able to outmaneuver the rest of Theodora's inner circle in 844, securing the exile of her brother Bardas. Rid of his rivals, Theoktistos held great sway over Byzantium for more than a decade. Thankfully, the Empress and the eunuch were quite a dynamic duo, doing an admirable job of running the state, and overseeing successes both at home and abroad. Although Theoktistos' intrigues against the other members of Theodora's inner circle, most notably her brother Bardas, would one day come back to bite him. For now, though, they had an empire to run. One of their first objectives was the recovery of Crete, which had been lost over a decade ago to Muslim invaders. Surprisingly, Theoktistos elected to lead the campaign himself, and more surprisingly still, he scored a near-total victory. By the end of 843, nearly the entire island was reconquered. Only the capital of Chandak still held out. But just as victory hoved into view, news reached Theoktistos that Theodora was about to remarry. Desperate not to be sidelined, the eunuch rushed home, only to find out that the rumours were false. He was blocked from finishing the job once more by the emir of Melitene, who invaded Anatolia. Theodora ordered Theoktistos to stop him, but during the battle some Arab troops serving the empire defected, leading to a Byzantine defeat. Simultaneously, the imperial forces in Crete were counterattacked and similarly crushed. The defeat in Anatolia led to nothing, with peace being signed the following year, but the defeat in Crete delayed the reconquest of the island by a century, and it would remain a painful thorn in Byzantium's side. 844 turned out to be a bad year for Byzantine arms, but future years would see the tide turn. The Byzantine position in the Balkans deteriorated when the Bulgars conquered vast swaths of Macedonia. Meanwhile, imperial forces put down a final rising of the Slavs in Greece. The Regency saw increased missionary activity in the Balkans, while in Constantinople itself, Theoktistos invested in the learning institutions of the empire, helping to spur on a cultural renaissance that would continue for the next few centuries. Perhaps the most enduring products of this intellectual resurgence were the Cyrillic and Glagolitic alphabets, which were devised by wise Byzantine missionaries as they tried to spread Christianity among the Slavs of Bulgaria and Moravia. Theoktistos' time in power also saw a revival in Byzantine sea power. For much of the 9th century, the imperial navy had been in decline. Now, the government began pouring money into its restoration, and consequently the empire was increasingly able to use the navy as a powerful strike arm. In 853, a fleet led by the eunuch Damianos captured and sacked Damietta in Egypt, which was subjected to another raid along its coasts the following year. Meanwhile, on the eastern front, Byzantium responded to raids by the Emir of Tarsus by invading Cilicia and sacking the city of Anazabus in 855. The Eastern Romans were now more bold and daring in their counterattacks, and more importantly, these counterattacks were now regularly bearing fruit. What didn't bear any positive fruit was the most shameful act of the Regency, the persecution of the Paulicans. This was a heretical but otherwise harmless Christian sect that existed along the empire's frontier with the Islamic world. Imperial persecutions had begun back in the 810s, but Theodora's regency relaunched them with a terrible zeal, aiming for nothing less than the destruction of these people. Thousands were killed, while many thousands more took up arms against their oppressors, making common cause with the Emir of Melitene to fight against Byzantium. Ultimately, the persecutions led to the formation of a Paulican state centred around the fort of Tefrike that left a gash in the eastern frontier that would not be healed for decades. In spite of this, Byzantine power continued to grow over these years, while the navy grew more dominant in the eastern Mediterranean. But if the imperial naval presence was growing in the east, then it was still eroding in the west, with the few remaining bastions of Byzantine Italy becoming more and more moth-eaten with each year. Back in 827, the Muslims had first gained a toehold in Sicily. That toehold became a foothold 4 years later, when they took the city of Palermo. Now, during the reign of Michael III, they continued to chip away at the imperial province, while the government was focused elsewhere. By the end of Michael's reign, Byzantium only held the eastern strip of the island, while the enterprising conquerors began to use Sicily as a staging ground for attacks further afield. For the past few decades, Italy had seen increasing numbers of Muslim pirates sailing along their shores and suffered under the depredations of the raiders. In 846, Rome itself was sacked by the Saracens. Yet, like the contemporary Vikings far to the north, there were many who hoped to make their conquests permanent. In the east, the Muslim advance was all but over. In the west, by contrast, where the empire's holdings were more tenuous, its forces more overstretched, industrious Islamic warbands continued to push ever further north. Striking by sea, emirates emerged at strategic port towns like Bari and Taranto, among others. Armed with these new bases, the pirates continued to throttle Italian sea lanes, while many expanded their operations to Dalmatia and the Adriatic. The Byzantines, distracted as they were in the east, failed to stem the advance. However, the improvements made to the Byzantine navy during this period would eventually allow Michael's successor to sweep southern Italy clean of the Saracen states, although the loss of Sicily would prove permanent. This period also saw Sardinia drift out of Byzantium's imperial orbit. Ever since the fall of Africa to the Arabs in the 690s, Sardinia had existed at the empire's furthest extremity, forcing it to become increasingly self-reliant. As Byzantium lost Sicily and lines of communication with Constantinople became strained, the island slowly drifted away. There is no direct date for the end of Byzantine Sardinia. There was no final break or dramatic conquest, but by the mid-9th century it was probably independent. Theoktistos' time at the top came to an end in 855. First and foremost, Michael was now 15 years old, nearly a man by medieval standards, and he began to tire of his mother's overbearing influence. The youthful emperor's discontent provided the perfect opportunity for a man who had thus far sat on the sidelines. Bardas, the empress's brother, and thus Michael's uncle, had been driven into exile by Theoktistos, if you recall, in 844. Ever since, he had been nursing a particularly gruesome grudge, and now he was ready to get even. Bardas was able to convince Michael that Theodora was planning to remarry, thus sidelining the young emperor. None of this was remotely true, but the emperor didn't need much convincing, and in 855 Theoktistos was seized as he was walking through the palaces. Suddenly alarmed by her son's rebelliousness, Theodora rushed to Theoktistos' cell, but was turned away, and the eunuch was then run through with a sword. She had come to rely greatly on the eunuch, and with his death her power came to an end. She railed against Michael and Bardas for their brutal act, but her words fell on deaf ears. Her time at the top was over. The following year, after Michael III celebrated his 16th birthday, he was proclaimed sole emperor in front of the Senate. What this meant in practice, however, was that Bardas ruled the realm. In truth, Michael simply didn't have it in him to rule an empire. He was weak-willed and pleasure-loving, and had no time for the admittedly tedious tasks of day-to-day governance. So it fell to Bardas to do them instead. Not that this was necessarily a bad thing. Far from it, for in many ways Bardas was everything that an emperor should be. Being both energetic and wise and far-sighted and diligent, the empire would be safe with him. In 859, Bardas was granted the high courtly title of Kuropalates. 3 years later, he was raised to the rank of Caesar, the highest in the empire. In his wars against the Muslims, Bardas could count on the support of his brother, Petronus, a gifted military commander. At the same time, he encouraged the young emperor to get out there and do some fighting for himself. And surprisingly, Michael proved to be a rather good leader and an inspired general. In 856, Petronus led a large-scale raid that penetrated as far as Amida in northern Mesopotamia, and Michael followed in his footsteps 3 years later, fording the Euphrates while it was in flood, and sacking Samosata. 859 also saw another successful naval raid on Egypt, and it was as imperial forces were preparing for another attack in 860 that frantic reports flooded out from the capital. Constantinople was under attack, but from who? Not the Arabs, and not the Bulgars. No, Constantinople was being menaced by the same people who were menacing seaside cities the continent over, the Norsemen. Using their flat-bottomed longships, they had been able to row down the many Russian rivers, raiding and trading and mixing with the local Slavs. In fact, it's from the Norse word for rowers that these easterly Vikings and their descendants got their name, the Rus. Plying the rivers of Russia, these Rus eventually came out in the Black and Caspian Seas, opening them up to the rich markets of Byzantium and the Orient. But as I say, the Rus were traders and raiders, and regardless of whether you were a trader or a raider, Constantinople made an attractive target. So it was that a huge fleet of Rus ships sailed south to plunder what they called MacLeod, the Great City. Yet for all the high drama of the raid, it proved to be brief. Constantinople's walls were as impregnable as ever, and the Rus soon ran out of suburbs to ransack. So before Michael and his armies could return, the raiders retreated over the horizon. This would not be the last time the Byzantines heard of the Rus, but now they could get back to fighting where it was most profitable, in the east. In 863 the Byzantines scored twin victories at the battles of Lalicon and Maya Farakin, resulting in the deaths of the Muslim leaders of Melitene and Armenia respectively. In the Balkans meanwhile, Byzantium continued to spar with Bulgaria. In this regard, the empire was in luck, for the Bulgars, under their energetic Khan Boris, were presently distracted in the west by wars with the Franks and Moravians. In 856 Bardas led a successful campaign to recover the borderlands lost to the empire, and then 7 years later Michael truly hit the jackpot. Once again Boris was distracted in the west. Adding to his troubles was the fact that southern Bulgaria was gripped by a terrible famine. It was a perfect storm, and Michael took his armies and ploughed them straight through the war-torn kingdom. All Boris could do was fold, and await whatever terms the Byzantines offered him. These, as it turned out, were simple enough, and fairly generous given the circumstances. First and foremost, Boris and his Bulgars must convert to Christianity, the Orthodox branch to be precise, and the Khan should come in person to Constantinople to be baptized. In return, the empire would hand over some of the border regions it had recently retaken. Boris accepted and hastened off to his baptism. The Byzantines were determined to bring Bulgaria into orthodoxy, and above all to nullify papal influence in the region. After a long pagan spell that began with the collapse of Roman power in the region, Christianity began to seep back into the Balkans, but the question of whether the Slavs would turn to Rome or Constantinople was still up in the air. Yet it wasn't just in the Balkans that Rome and Constantinople locked horns. In fact, Christianity stood on the brink of another major schism. Though thankfully for us, this one wouldn't be fought over the finer points of theological doctrine. Rather, it involved two simple but interwoven problems. Was the Pope in Rome the undisputed top dog of the faith, outranking even the Patriarch of Constantinople? And could the Byzantine Emperor appoint and depose patriarchs at will? In 857, after various disputes, Bardas and Michael III forced the then Patriarch, a certain Ignatios, to resign. In his place they installed a well-read man called Photios. Pope Nicholas I was determined to stamp his authority on the Byzantine Church, and so he condemned the improper deposition of Ignatios, as well as his replacement with Photios, a man who had, just 5 days prior to his enthronement, never held a church position in his life. Things came to a head in 863, when Nicholas excommunicated Photios. It was against this backdrop of schism that the Christianization of Bulgaria got underway. The Bulgarians, however, were alarmed by all the foreign Orthodox priests that flooded their land, for the Christian practices they preached did not mesh well with the pagan population. So Boris sent a letter to Photios, asking firstly whether a few select folk practices might be allowed to continue, and secondly whether Bulgaria could have a patriarch of its own. Some of what Boris asked was very practical. Allowing the Bulgarians to keep a few local traditions would help Christianity mix into the local culture. Besides, once Christianity was firmly embedded, the authorities could always take a firmer line. Photios, however, bluntly refused to consider any of it. In doing so, he completely fumbled a perfect opportunity, because when Boris sent the same demands to Pope Nicholas, he was far more open-minded. He granted some of Boris's requests, and when he refused one or two, he made sure to gently explain why. Although Nicholas also refused him a Bulgarian patriarch, the evident time and care that the Pope showed towards Bulgaria's culture pleased Boris, and so he swung towards the Roman Church. Ultimately, neither the Photian Schism nor the return of Bulgaria to Orthodoxy would happen while Michael lived. The botching of the Bulgarian question was probably his government's greatest single failure. In 867, Photios excommunicated the Pope, widening the schism further, and ensuring that, although the schism would end, the scars it left in Christianity would never disappear. But the fate of Photios would have to wait for the reign of Michael's successor, who we will discuss properly in the next video. In the end, what are we to make of Michael III? Despite the emperor's personal dislike of responsibility, his reign saw immense advances for the Byzantine Empire. The icons restored, the navy rebuilt, the army resurgent. Naturally, much of the credit for this must go to others, to Theodora, to Theoktistos, to his uncles Patronus and Bardas. Michael himself was never a talented administrator, usually shedding as much responsibility for governance as possible onto others, though this usually gave his powerful and competent ministers more space to get on with the boring but necessary spadework that kept Byzantium on a sound footing. No one can seriously deny that Michael was a mediocre governor, but put him at the head of an army and a different side to him emerged. Taking after his uncles, Bardas and Patronus, the emperor would from a young age lead armies against the enemies of the empire, and he would do a damn good job of it too. The image we get of Michael, especially from the Arab sources which don't have the biases of later Macedonian-era historians, is one of a brave and talented commander. Imperial confidence grew under his watch. Byzantine armies increasingly took the fight to their Muslim foes, and their Muslim foes increasingly found themselves unable to hold back the tide. The empire slowly began to take advantage of the crumbling Abbasid Caliphate and started routinely drubbing the smaller emirates in the border regions. So then, this was an era of great success, but there were problems, of which Michael's laziness and fecklessness were the most glaring. Thus far, he had been incredibly lucky to have at his side advisors who were, despite their own personal ambitions, both very skilled and very loyal. In my mind, Theodora, Theoktistos and Bardas ultimately had the best interests of the emperor at heart. This had allowed the system of governance to work well enough so far. Michael threw himself into the thrilling business of warfare, while his advisors took care of the more boring aspects of governance. But what if, by some means, Michael fell under the malign influence of someone who didn't have his best interests at heart? Someone who would use his influence to enact insidious ends? Strength of will was not Michael's forte, therefore this was a very real possibility. Bardas held sway at court for now, but would that change? And if so, who would change it? These questions would be answered by a new and enigmatic figure at the imperial court. His name was Basil the Macedonian, a provincial peasant and a horse-tamer from the Balkan frontier. In time, he would carve a dark and bloody path through Michael's court, his eyes fixed on one goal: the throne itself. But the rise of Basil the Macedonian and the twilight of Michael's reign will have to await the next episode, which, fortunately for you, is already out. Many thanks to Chris Manger, the channel's Consul tier member.